On June 25th, 1865, Hudson Taylor founded China Inland Mission, along with others that supported him. He said this about their mission and about their purpose. He said, "We wish to see churches and Christian Chinese presided over by pastors and officers of their own countrymen, worshiping the true God in the land of their fathers, Man, I can't read my own handwriting this morning. In the costume of their fathers, in their own tongue wherein they were born, and in edifices of a thoroughly Chinese style of architecture." That sounds like a lot of stuff. That's what Hudson Taylor had to say. So what did he do with this mission? He did some things that were extremely radical for a missions agency in the 19th century. One thing that he did was he invited working class people to become missionaries. Up until then, missions agencies had sought out people from the upper classes, people of means, but he went after working class people. He invited single women to come and be missionaries in China. Nobody else was willing to do that. He was interdenominational in his approach. He would take Methodists, he would take Lutherans, he would take Episcopalians. He didn't care, Anglicans then, he didn't care who came. Another thing that he did that was radical, and we'll talk about this part of it a little bit later, he didn't solicit for finances. They just went. And he said, God will provide. We won't have any debt, but we won't go looking for money either. He had his missionaries, his workers, dress like Chinese. They wore the same clothes that the locals wore. They worshiped in the homes of Chinese people. They trained converts to be self-governing and self-supporting. Most mission agencies weren't that forward-thinking back then, that you wanted the church led by Chinese nationals, and you wanted to train up local pastors to take over so that they could run the church themselves. Just about everybody does that now, but this was radical in the 19th century. They had tremendous success, hundreds of thousands of converts, especially in the remote sections of China that no one had ever been to before with the gospel. Unfortunately, from 1949 to 1952, they had what they called a reluctant exodus. Chinese Inland Mission had to take all of their missionaries from all the different places they had brought them to China out of the country because of the communist revolution. They weren't safe. Their lives were in danger. They redeployed them throughout Southeast Asia instead. Became Overseas Missionary Fellowship. Had to, of course, change their name since they weren't in China anymore. It was a radical attempt by Hudson Taylor, one that was extremely successful. We're going to be talking about some things connected to those ideas as we look at the first part of 3 John, the first half of it. We'll look at the second half next week. So the first 8 verses of 1 John, it begins with this. John says, "The elder to my dear friend Gaius, who I love in the truth." This is once again a letter from the Apostle John to one of the leaders of a church that he has worked closely with before. Whether he founded this church or he's just in fellowship with it, we're not sure, but he works with these people. He knows them, but we don't know anything about Gaius. There are a number of Gaiuses in the New Testament, but this isn't one of those. This letter tells us some good things about him, but that's all we know. Notice that he says, "whom I love in the truth." We saw that last week when we looked at 2 John, that the truth was central to love, that there was an intimate connection between love and truth for John. That is true throughout all of his writings, the Gospel of John and all of his letters. Let's get in the meat of what he has to say. He says this, "Dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well." Ought to remind you a little bit about what we just did a little bit earlier, right? Praying for people's health, talking about their needs, their physical needs. The physical, emotional part of our lives matter too. Not just the spiritual. We obviously focus heavily on the spiritual here as a church, but the rest of it matters too. People's resource needs, people's physical needs, relational needs, all of those things matter. Because we are not human beings that are divided into little pieces. We don't have an emotional part, an intellectual part, a spiritual part, and a physical part. They're all together. They're all connected. We know that because when our physical self is suffering, it hurts our emotional self. When our physical self is imperiled, sometimes our intellectual capacities are affected. We understand these things, and the spiritual is no different. It is intimately connected to all of those. So that reminds us, as John takes a moment here, away from the business of the church, to talk about Gaius' health, it reminds us that not all church business has to be about church business. All right? We don't have to be businesslike in all of our approaches. We don't have to be laser focused all of the time, because the time that we spend building friendships, when we share our ups and downs, catch up on recent news in each other's lives, that is time well spent. I know that some in places where you might work, some employers are not a fan of chit-chat on the job. They're like, focus, get to work, right? Maybe even if you work in a business where there's a lot of customer service, they might not even want chit-chat there. Just take care of the customer and move on to the next one. Don't talk about their lives. Don't see how they're doing. They're business. We got to make money. Time is money, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's not what we do here. Okay, that's not what the church is about. Before church, when people are talking, having coffee and donuts and interacting and catching up on their lives, during our greeting time, and then of course after church, that is some of the most useful time that we spend as a church, because we're doing something very important there. We are trying to take that concept, that idea, that intellectual concept that we have, that theological truth that we know of the church family, and we're trying to make it a reality. We use that phrase, do we not? We use that all the time, our church family. We talk about church family. And of course, people who've never been to church, people that aren't connected to a church, probably have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about church family. Those of you who have been a part of a congregation, who have become enmeshed in that, know exactly what I mean when I say church family. Because the people here in this congregation that you've gotten to know over the years, you've prayed with them, they've prayed with you, you've been to weddings for them or funerals that are connected to them. That connection makes this like a family. And for some of us, the family you have here is better than the family you have out there. You're closer to the family here, or there's more of them. I guess some of you have huge families, but we're right here. Some of our families are scattered all over the country, all over the world, but your church family is here every Sunday. And so John takes the time to say, Gaius, I hope that your health is well. He says, I pray for your soul, but I pray for your health too. And that reminds us that is exactly what we need to be about, the whole person, the health of the entire thing. He says, it gave me great joy when some believers came and testified about your faithfulness to the truth, telling how you continue to walk in it. Here we see the value of the connections between Christians from other churches. These were people from the church that Gaius went to, going and talking to John at whatever church he was connected to, and they were interacting together. Whether that's locally with our church or the church down the street, or denominationally with our church and First Baptist of Meadville or First Baptist of Linesville or one of our other Baptist churches, that connection gives us a chance for both mutual encouragement. We can help each other and say good things about each other and encourage each other, and accountability. When things are not going well, there are other churches, other church bodies that might be able to help out. By the way, here's another chance. Tonight is the week of Christian Unity service at Christ Episcopal in Oil City. I'll keep saying it. That's a reminder. It just so happens to go with what I'm talking about here. But notice this. John received great joy when he heard this news. And this is very important. John was emotionally invested in the spiritual well-beings of the Christians that he knew. The Christians that he knew, he was emotionally invested in how well they were doing spiritually. In other words, he could gain great joy when they were walking in their faith. And conversely, he would feel great sorrow if they walked away from it. He cared about what happened to them. So that brings us to an interesting question. How do we react to the news that we hear about other churches, whether they're locally or across the country? You read, as we have, about news about the United Methodist Church and the things they're dealing with. We hear news, as we did earlier this year, about the death of Tim Tigert. We hear news about the closing of the St. Pat's School. Good news, bad news. Things happen in churches that are not our own. How do we feel about that? How do we feel when that is happening at a church that's not on our list of favorites? They do X, Y, and Z, and we're not just weird. We don't like it. That's not us. Does it bother us if they're having success? Do we not feel sorrow if they're struggling because they're not in our niche? I hope not. Hopefully, what we really do is believe that there is only one church, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, as the scriptures tell us. And so if one part of Christ's church is succeeding, we are all succeeding. If one part of Christ's church is failing, we are all feeling that failure because we are certainly all in it together. John was emotionally invested in how things went with this other church and the people in it. And so John had value. He saw value and purpose in sharing a compliment with Gaius. He saw an opportunity to bolster the faith of others. And let me tell you that is a powerful spiritual gift, the ability to share compliments. Some of us are good at it and some of us are not. But I have met a few people over the years that are amazing at that. They always seem to have that word of encouragement, that word of congratulations that other people need. And when they share it, it lights up that other person. It bolsters them. It encourages them powerfully. Not a lot of people get in line for that. If there were lines for the spiritual gifts, for the gifts that you could get, not a lot of people would get in line for that because it's about other people entirely. You're encouraging other people. It doesn't say much about, it doesn't give you anything flashy. It doesn't give you anything that most people are going to notice. But that is amazing. The ability to see people and their lives and say, this is a person I could encourage with a nice word, with a kind word, with a compliment about a job well done, with an encouraging word about sticking with something difficult. Why is it so powerful? Why is it so necessary? For a very simple reason, it multiplies. You do that to one person and help that person, and then they go and affect a bunch of other people. It's a domino effect or a butterfly effect, if you want to think of it that way. John here shares encouragement about the faithfulness, about the works of Gaius, and he shares it in a way that would have encouraged Gaius to continue. Then he says this very profound truth: I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. That is absolutely true. Now, we know that is entirely true about our biological children, right? We all know that. I am not afraid to tell you that it got me right here this morning to hear how loudly Clara was singing. Did you hear her echoes? She was doing the echo on the song this morning. We went through that song once before you all got here. I usually listen to them once before you guys to make sure I remember how the song goes. And she sang it with me then. She was singing the words. She knew what was going on. That gets me, because that's my kid. That's my daughter, right? It's our only child. John's talking about our spiritual children here, about those who have come to faith because of the will of God, not because we brought them into the world, but because the Spirit of God called them out of darkness into the light. And John says, these are my children, and no greater joy can I have than to see that they continue to walk in the light when other people are following the Master's footsteps. So what do we want for the next generation? We talk about that. We talk about that with our children. What do you want for the next generation? Maybe you want the next generation to go to college because in your generation nobody did. Or you want the next generation to move to a nicer neighborhood, right? To do better. That's what we always want for our kids. What do we want for the spiritual children? For those who have come to faith in Jesus Christ and are connected to the church that we are connected to, what do we want for them? What we ought to want is for them to have the same faith as us. Now, of course, that presumes that we have faith that is proper, right? That is mature, that is righteous, that is following in the light. We obviously need that, otherwise we would want them to have something different. But in theory, we want them to have what we have. We want to replicate in them a mature discipleship. We want them to have a passion for others receiving the gospel, just as we are supposed to have. We're supposed to be making people like us. People that, like us, are trying to be like Jesus. John says, if I see that, I'm golden. That's good. That's all that I want, is to see that in other people, to see other people walking in faith. He uses that phrase quite a bit, walking in the truth, walking in the light. That's something that John uses throughout, especially in 1 John. He uses it again and again and again, this idea of walking in something. It's ongoing, it's continual, it's habitual. You see, John likes to say that we are either walking in the light or we are walking in the darkness. We are either walking in the truth or we are walking in falsehood. We are walking either way. Nobody is standing still. Everybody is heading towards a goal, heading in a direction. The only question is which one. And so John says to see fellow Christians still walking towards that goal of Christ-likeness, still walking in faith and in the fruit of the Spirit, that gives him great joy. Because it tells him, I did my job. I did what I was supposed to do. Look, there's my proof. See, it's happening in other people. And for John, that was tremendous. Notice, keep in mind that John is writing this near the end, towards the end of a long life of apostleship. He is the last of the apostles, the only one not martyred as far as we can tell. And seeing that another generation was going to carry on made everything worth it for him. He says this, he says, "Dear friend, you are faithful in what you're doing for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. They have told the church about your love. Please send them on their way in a manner that honors God." We're going to see next week that John wrote this letter to the church that Gaius is at in the midst of turmoil for that church. They have a gentleman there, and we'll look at what he was up to next week, that was somehow power hungry. He was taking that church in bad directions because of his desire to be the one in charge. And yet in the midst of that, even with that trouble going on, Gaius and whoever was helping him, I assume he had help, he's kind of probably the leader of this group of people that are being faithful, he is continuing to do what God has called him to do. Faithfulness in the midst of turmoil will always receive high praise from God. It is one thing to be faithful when times are good. It's still right. Please be faithful when times are good. I'm not telling you not to do it then, but it's quite another to be faithful when everything is falling apart around you. When the building is on fire and you're walking around calmly doing your job. That's an amazing thing. Gaius was able to ignore that noise, to set that aside, all of those troubles that church had with that individual, and focus on the mission. They were able to combine hospitality. These missionaries, these teachers had come to their town to share the gospel, to train disciples, and they let them stay in their home. They fed them. They took care of their needs, and then they sent them on their way with further, probably food in this case, further support. They were showing the love of God and being faithful. And Gaius was the one spearheading this effort to make sure that these missionaries were taken care of. And John says, bravo, good job. That's exactly what I want to see, and you deserve praise for it. One of the things that we see sometimes is that too often churches fall into what we call survival mode. They protect their things. They don't give sufficient resources to the planting of new seed or the tilling of new fields. They're too busy trying to make sure they survive to take the time and the effort and put the resources toward making sure they replicate for the future. That's not a tenable position. That will end. If all you are doing is surviving, at some point that will not be enough and you'll cease to exist. You see, we do need an inward focus. We need to be worried about health and vitality and worship and discipleship that is happening here in these walls. We absolutely need to do that. Can't neglect that. But at the same time, we also need an outward focus. Evangelism and outreach, building bridges to people and communities and other churches. We need both inward and outward. We need to worry about those people who are here now and what they need, and those who will be here by the grace of God in the future. We don't know who they are. They're not here yet. But at some point, God will bring them here. The Spirit of God will call them here, in part probably because of connections to us in our outreach effort, but there are future people and present people, and we need to care about both. We need to be working for both. So what John is commending Gaius and those who helped him for is giving sufficient support to that effort to train and reach out and build new churches and find new Christians. Whatever, financial support, emotional support, spiritual support, whatever they gave, training, resources, whatever it was that was needed, they made sure the people had it. I find that in stark contrast. As I was looking for songs this week that were connected to evangelism, connected to missions, in part because that's what Gaius was helping support, I thought about this one. It's 310 in our hymnal. It's called So Send I You. A lot of you know it, and most of it I really like. But the first verse has always bothered me, because the first verse is talking, and I'm going to read it in a minute, about what we should be willing to do as Christians. But given what John is saying here this morning, it is something that no Christian should ever have to do. Let me read it. It says this: So send I you to labor unrewarded, to serve unpaid, unloved, unsought, unknown, to bear rebuke, to suffer scorn and scoffing. So send I you to toil for me alone. There have been missionaries in Christian history, in particular when they went into hostile areas. I'm thinking of the missionaries that went to the Vikings or other groups that were hostile, where many of them were martyred. Many of them went alone. Many of them went with very few resources. But by and large, that should never happen. Missionaries and people who are going out with the gospel should not be going alone. They should not feel alone. They should not be unpaid. They should not be unsupported. They should be the exact opposite. They should feel that they are part of a team, that they have support, that they have resources, that we are willing to sacrifice and give so that they have what they need to share the gospel. They shouldn't be worrying about feeding their children while they're trying to share the gospel with the lost. So as much as that first verse talks about the call and the willingness to sacrifice, we should never make missionaries do that. They shouldn't have to. We should feel ashamed if that's what they end up doing. The last part says this: it was for the sake of the name that they went out, receiving no help from the pagans. We ought therefore to show hospitality to such people, so that they may work together for the truth. That last phrase is what I like here this morning. May we work together for the truth. Notice that they went out on behalf of the name. In this case, he means the name of Jesus, but that is a phrase that meant something to Jewish Christians. Because when Jewish people spoke about the name of God, they were, of course, talking about Yahweh. And that would have been the sacred name that John grew up with, that he would not have said out loud. The most pious Jews never said that name out loud, lest they somehow take it in vain. Of course, the name of Jesus is one we speak many times. We sing it all the time. But that name is sacred to us. We lift up the glory of God. We respond to the love of God. We further the purpose of God, all for the glory of God. As Paul writes in Philippians 2, that after the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Notice that last phrase, to the glory of God the Father. And so for the sake of that name, they went out. They left their home, they left their lives, and they went to share the gospel. Now, they did not expect to receive help from the pagans. Why would you? Right? We don't expect the people who we're taking the gospel to pay for the gospel to come to them. It doesn't work that way. That worked that way in the first century, though. Greek philosophers and other people of the mystery religions, they would go from town to town teaching disciples and training people in what they were doing, but those people had to support the teacher. Not so the early Christian missionaries. They didn't work in that method, in that system. We can't expect the gospel to be supported by the lost. It's the found who bear the cost of supporting the gospel, because we need the gospel to be given away freely. There are no strings attached. There should not be any strings attached when the gospel comes from us. There are absolutely strings attached because God demands the fruit of the Spirit. God demands righteous living of those who repent and are saved. They obviously owe God a great deal, and they are responsible to God just as we are. But for us, with us, there are no strings attached. We share the gospel freely, not for a price, and not for don't you hate when you sign up for something and then at the bottom in print that you obviously are not intended to be able to read because it's so small, it tells you that after the trial period, it goes from $5.99 a month to $39.99 a month. No need for you to do anything. You can cancel at any time, but if you don't cancel, they're going to jack it up. If our sharing of the gospel resembles that, who wants it? Right? My goodness, strings attached, we can't do that. My dad is a Gideon. We have the Gideons out here every Apple Fest. They don't say, here's a Bible, $2. They give Bibles away. They take in donations from people like us so that they can buy Bibles so that they can give them away for free. And they give them away for free by the tens of millions of Bibles. It's what they've been doing since their founding. In the end, we ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together for the truth. That we involved more than one church, did it not? John in the church he was in, Gaius in the church that he was in. We are working together for the truth. Everybody on the side of the truth of God is potentially our partner in the gospel effort. They are on our team. So in a town like this, Franklin, Pennsylvania, population under 10,000, small rural county in western PA, in a town like this, it would be foolish of us to duplicate the efforts of different churches, to do the exact same thing that another church is doing. And thankfully, most of the time we don't do that. We share that burden. For example, the food pantry. There are 2 of them basically in town, but why would we need 12 or 13 or 15 of them, one for each church? The only reason we would need one church for each food pantry is pride. If it needs to be our food pantry so that we get the credit for having the food pantry. There are some towns and communities that are like that, where it matters which church gets the credit and whose name is on it, and nobody is willing to share. Thank God that's not this town, because that is unhealthy. I will leave it at that. I will not say what I really feel. That's not cool. So how then can we build mutual trust and friendship? Because that's what happens when we work with another church and another church and another church at a common cause for a common goal. We build mutual friendships with the people of those other churches, the people you volunteer alongside. You get to know them more. We build trust. We break down barriers. We demonstrate to the lost that we care more about the gospel than we do about the things that we disagree with that other church about. We reinforce our belief that the gospel transcends our differences. Not everybody believes that it does, but it absolutely does, and it ought to. So how do we support them? Well, John was talking about hospitality. Maybe there's a chance for that. We certainly have a chance for financial support and the support of resources. We have the chance to share labor, volunteer. We have the chance to support or to educate people about those ministries and train people to help those ministries, to recruit people to join in those ministries. And absolutely, we have the opportunity to pray for those ministries. So I thought it might do us good for just a moment to end by talking about who is it that we're partnering with. Who do we partner with? I've been talking about this whole time, but I would be remiss if I didn't say, where do we partner? So I want to start from the big picture and work our way down. On the biggest level are our partners in the American Baptist churches. We are an American Baptist church, part of the American Baptist Churches USA. And so we have partners on the national level with American Baptist churches. Things like international missions are a part of that. International missions are who the Smiths work with. And so that's national. But we also have partners in ABCOPAD, the American Baptist Churches of Pennsylvania and Delaware, with our regional staff. Frank and Mark and Jeff, our regional staff, and Carol and the rest of the people that work in Pennsylvania and Delaware. And I do a lot of stuff with them, stuff that this church allows me to do because it knows the value of that partnership. I serve on the regional board, representing our area churches to that board. I serve on the ACTS committee, ACTS. It's our training for lay ministers to get people certified as lay ministers. I'm on that board. I just started that one this fall. I go to the biennial conference every 2 years. I go to the pastor's retreat in the spring. I do all of that stuff, and with the French Creek Association, which is a smaller step, because we know the value of that relationship we have with our denomination, with fellow churches that are like-minded, that we see eye to eye with on most things. So we have those partnerships. But we also have some partnerships with national organizations or regional organizations that are not American Baptists. When we support those, like Youth for Christ and Child Evangelism Fellowship and the Gideons. Those are 3 that are not local, but we support the local manifestation of that with our funds, with our volunteering, and other things. We have things that are not connected to the denomination that we support, like the Brileys in their missions work and their translations work in Papua. We've been supporting them for decades. Before them, we supported the Moffats before they retired. We're coming to the end of supporting the Fullers with Awana because they're retiring. So we've got those organizations that we are connected to and support. We have county-wide things. that we are involved in that are under the auspices of the Venango County Christian Ministerium, which I happen to be on that board. We have those. And by the way, tonight is the Week of Christian Unity service. I'll say it again, at Christ Episcopal Church at 6 p.m. That is a Venango County Christian Ministerium event. We've got 3 of those a year. We've got another one on Palm Sunday and one for Thanksgiving, a chance to worship with other Christians. Venango County Christian Ministerium also is an umbrella oversight over Mustard Seed Missions and Emmaus Haven, are 2 organizations of physically helping people in our community that are county-wide. But we have things that are just in Franklin as well. All of these layers of partnerships and people that we are working with for the common cause of helping people and sharing the gospel. On the local level, we have our crosswalk on Good Friday. Amazingly well attended. It goes from St. Pat's to here to First Church and down the street. It's awesome. And then we have a Good Friday service that is the whole town. In addition, we have a 4th of July service that is for the whole town. We also have here in town the food pantry that we support. And we have other things like the Central Help Fund that we support. The time that I use to help those organizations, to interact with those organizations, is provided by you people. You know that, right? Every minute, every hour that I use supporting Mustard Seed Missions, or the Central Help Fund, or Emmaus Haven, or the Venango County Christian Ministerium, or ABCOPAD, there's a long list, is time that this church allows me to use for those ministries. Not every church does that. Some churches tell their minister, you worry about us. You deal with our problems. And if they have that attitude, they probably have problems that the guy's going to need to spend that much time on. But this church has never done that. And one of the reasons I came here was because you guys cared about ecumenical ministry. You guys cared about working in the community for the cause of Christ. And so we are blessed to have commitments and partnerships and friendships that go from the church across the street, right? Right over there is First United Methodist. Right over there is St. Pat's, Christ, and St. John's are right there. From those churches that we could all be at in less than a minute, to churches all around the country, we have partnerships with and work with, notice at the end of this phrase, so that we may work together for the truth. That's why we do it. That's why we partner locally. That's why we partner regionally. That's why we partner internationally, is for the sake of the truth. And we support each of those as best we can with our funds, with our volunteering, with our prayer, and all sorts of things. One of the things that we've developed over the last couple of years, I want to give a shout out to, because that's not my normal MO. I don't know if I've ever used the word shout out. Is that our missions rep, Tom Tidd, has been communicating with our missionaries more than we ever have before, I think. And that's very encouraging to me. I didn't make him do that. I didn't tell him to do it. He just said, oh, I'm the missions rep. I'll write the missionaries. And so he talks to Jeff Johnson about the pain he has in his hands and feet and keeps an eye on how Jeff is doing. Talks to the Brileys about, because they've had surgeries and whatnot. Talks to the Smiths. And by talk, I mean in this day and age, it's email. But we communicate with them, support them. All of this stuff matters. Because all of this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. All of this is the church of Jesus Christ. All of this is the mission of the church. And it cannot be simply what happens within our building. And it cannot simply be what happens within our congregation. We need to look outside as well. And John commends Gaius for doing just that. Three takeaways I want you to remember. This church needs its people to be friends and family. Absolutely. If you ask people why they stay at a church they visit, one of the most common things is the people were friendly. And the number one reason why they don't come back, nobody said hi to me. Nobody was nice to me. If that happens, they are never coming back. So this church needs to be, for the sake of witness, but also for the sake of the health of the building, of the people here, it needs to be family. We need to be friends. John knew that, and we know it too. Second, reminds me of the phrase from business school kind of stuff, always be closing, right? Always be closing the sale. Well, we need to always be planting as a church. Always be planting seeds somewhere. Always be seeking the opportunity to grow and mentor and disciple. That's always our business. And then thirdly, missions is absolutely a group effort. We need people working together for the truth. The Smiths will soon be going back to Haiti when Brian's health returns. Remember, he had to come back here because he had both dengue fever and that other thing that I can't pronounce that is equally bad. He had them both at the same time. It almost killed him. So they had to come back here. They're going to be going back soon. But it's not just them going. They're the ones taking the biggest risk. They're the ones making the biggest effort, obviously. But we are supporting them, and are a number of other churches, as is International Missions. They're not going alone, as that song said. They are absolutely not going alone, and we cannot let that happen. So I thank you this morning for allowing me and encouraging this church to be outwardly focused. I don't have to fight to get you guys to let me do that. Maybe that doesn't sink in. Maybe you don't understand that. That makes a massive difference to me. So many of my brothers, so many of my sisters in ministry spend so much time fighting their own congregation to allow them as ministers to do what they believe the right thing is. There's only so much that we have in here. Only so much passion, only so much energy, only so much drive. Every bit of it wasted on trying to get the congregation on the same page is stuff that didn't go out there. And so let me give you, Gaius received thanks from John for doing the right thing. Let me thank you as a congregation for supporting me, for supporting the ministries that we do, for volunteering, for making this a church family. Thank you.